myself.
Actually, I want to introduce Rabbi to the room. Rabbi Asher Meza, thank you. How are you this evening? How was your jog?
Good. How's it going, everybody?
You actually have a really great formula for this problem. Actually, what you're saying, the formula. I mean, you talk about this all the time, so you're just rehashing the same thing over and over again. But for Vaughn, who's new, your formula is Torah is the foundation. That's what holds everything together, and then you have the extra biblical criteria. What is the Mashiach? What is the Messiah? What is resurrection? What is heaven? What is hell? These are, I guess you can say, quote unquote, these extra books, which is Ron saying, well, let me read what I want to read. Let me choose what's optional. But there's a formula for that you have sort of proposed.
It depends what you consider Torah. If you ask the average rabbi what's Torah, they include even what the rabbi teaches as Torah, their Rav Muvchak. When I say Torah, I just mean the 5 books of Moses, and everything else is commentary. It's there to build up the 5 books of Moses. So this is why it doesn't really matter what the Catholic Church introduced or what the rabbi sanctioned as books that are uplifting, which are basically the books of the prophets and the writings. Are there to bring you closer to God, bring you ultimately closer to Torah. Why? Because none of those books could add or take away from the Torah. They're only there to amplify the Torah. So any other book, whether it's the Zohar, whether it's a Tanya, heck, even if it's the New Testament, if it's there to bring you closer to Torah and to God, then it doesn't have to be destroyed. It doesn't have to be burned. Only because something is not part of Torah. I mean, heck, the biggest downfall of religion nowadays is the Catholic Church creating the notion of Tanakh. The notion of Tanakh was invented by the Catholic Church. Why? Because no Jew would ever combine the books of the prophets and the writings alongside the books of the Torah. Not to mention the New Testament. The average, even Karaite Jew, behaves a little bit like a Christian in not making a distinction between the book of Exodus and the book of Amos, or the book of Bereshit and the book of Yeshayahu. In other words, for them, it's all the word of God. That's problematic because the 5 books of Moses says not to add or take away from it. So anything that happens to appear after it is only there to amplify it, not to add to it.
So if that's the case, if these books are to be there to amplify the word of God, which is what we're calling Torah, then wouldn't necessarily be an issue? Then wouldn't it be, Rabbi? It wouldn't necessarily be an issue if it was added to the Torah, because it's amplifying it anyway.
In terms of adding to the Torah, what they mean actually adding commandments, do's and don'ts to what God expects you to do. That's what the Torah means, not adding to these instructions. The narrative in the Torah revolves around instructions given on Mount Sinai. So if your theology seems to add to the Torah, then it's not necessarily the fault of the text that you're elevating, but perhaps the way you're interpreting them. And this is what I tell Christians. If they're reading the prophets in a way that they find themselves now being forced to believe more than the Torah actually commands you to, then you're reading the text incorrectly. And that happens a lot, even with Jews, just because there's so much hyperbole, there's so much poetry and symbolism in there. These books were never meant to be dogmatic. They're only really there to be historical, to tell you that, you know what, God did this in the past and he could do it again today. He used them and he could use you, right? But it's ultimately to bring you back to the 5 books, to that individual moral training that I believe we received on Mount Sinai.
Right. That's what all the prophets called for every time, was to return to the Torah.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
are you saying, therefore, that the book of Daniel and book of Revelations was referring to Nero and the sacking of Rome? Am I hearing you right?
No. So I take a different, well, first of all, I don't believe in the book of Revelation, but in terms of the book of Daniel, I don't believe that it goes past 40 years after the time of Daniel. I interpret it literally. And I know that there's many rabbis like Rashi and the whole host of rabbis who take almost a Christian perspective and point it to a messianic figure that's coming 400 years down the road. I just don't see it that way. Now, the book of Daniel is a little problematic. The rabbis never considered Daniel a prophet for many different reasons. One, he was living outside of the land of Israel, so people believe that you could only attain prophecy in the land of Israel. And then you're able to prophesy outside. Like Ezekiel is a prophet who prophesied in Babylon, but he attained prophecy in Israel. Also, it's hard to place Daniel, especially who he's speaking about, which Cyrus, and I really focus on Daniel chapter 9 from the beginning to the end. Once you start getting to Daniel chapter 12, this is really the basis for what we know as the resurrection of the dead and all these concepts that are not mentioned literally in the 5 books of Moses. This is why you're walking on dangerous ground. I mean, just because there's a lot of nuance there that people fail to check against the Torah. So I don't really teach the book of Daniel outside of Daniel chapter 9. I have a whole video on the 40 weeks and what that actually means. From my perspective, this is all opinion. We don't know exactly what Daniel is speaking about, especially with his dreams. But yeah, I don't believe in the book of Revelation, and I don't believe that. I think you're referring to the abomination that causes desolation, that they point that to Nero. I don't, yeah.
Well, here it says there's a city that sits on 7 hills.
Mm-hmm. But that's only in the New Testament.
There's only one city that sits on 7. I mean,
correct, Rome.
Yeah, Rome. It's Rome. Yeah, absolutely.
That's only according to the book of Revelation. Jews don't believe in the book of Revelation.
I don't understand why people are so hung up about this thing. There is literally only one city on this earth that sits on 7 hills, and that is Rome.
I don't think people are hung up on that. People understood that, especially, when John of Patmos was seeing this vision, right. Israel was occupied by Rome.
Exactly.
It's no secret. I've never heard anyone say that the city that sits on 7 hills is anything but Rome.
Well, I mean, you got people out there saying that it's America, for crying out loud. You got people saying that it's a revived Roman Empire over in Europe, and I'm like, whatever. People are free to believe what they want to believe, but I personally feel like it was referring to Nero. And like I said, there's only one city on earth that sits on 7 hills. That is Rome.
In terms of prophecy in the Bible, I believe that 99.9% of what we consider prophecy either already happened or expired. And if it did happen, it happened in and around the life of that prophet. The books of the prophets were never meant to be used as an almanac of things to come. Right? Every generation feels like this is the last days. I don't think that's what God wanted us to deal with.
Isn't that explicitly forbidden in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses, to look for the future, to go to fortune tellers to tell you what will be happening?
It's prohibited to go to a medium. I mean, although we see King Saul like 7 Samuel, God himself says, I think in Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 29, that the secret things are for God, and only what he has revealed to us is for us to do. That's it. That we really shouldn't worry about what comes next or what came before. There's actually a statement in the Talmud like this, that someone who says what's above, what's below, what's before, and what's after, it's better that he was never born. Now, everything, I mean, just open up YouTube. Everything is about the afterlife, hell. All these YouTube rabbis, everything is Gehenna Olam Haba, Gehenna, guys. It seems that God doesn't want us to be so preoccupied with the afterlife by the simple fact that he never mentions it in the 5 books of Moses. He mentions this life. It seems like heaven is on this earth. Hell is seeing your children not grow old, not getting rain in its season. That's the agrarian society that appears in the Bible. And then all these metaphysical ideas that scare people into believing. And heck, when you scare someone into believing, that person's not going to believe for too long. That's just the way it is. So yeah, I mean, you may get a lot of hits on YouTube, but it doesn't help the religious community, especially for the inquisitive college kid who's really looking for an ethical outlet. If when looking up Judaism, all he hears about that if you wear a wig, you're going to hell, like these stupid ideas.
Should I mention that everybody back in the 1700s wore a wig? Should I mention that?
All right, well, we're talking about in the Jewish world. Clearly, yes, George Washington wore a wig. You know.
They all did. They all wore a wig.
No, we're talking about women.
But I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled to hear you say, Rabbi, that you agree with me that these are things that it's already happened, it's already been done, and it really, you spoke about fear. Okay, well, you have people out there and groups out there and institutions out there even that live for fear, that live in that fear. Oh, well, they found a cornerstone, and it just happens to be a cornerstone exactly like the old Solomon's temple, and they found ashes of a red heifer, and they and I'm like, man,
Well, it works the other way around also. It could be enticement. That's also a problem. Religion is not there also just to make us feel good. And this is one of the main reasons I'm against modern day paganism. And I understand that you consider yourself a pagan, because when you don't have law, all you have is fear and enticement. That's the only thing that's going to attract you to delving in the next world or the underworld or the spirit world. Because what else is there to gain? Now, the Bible tells you how to live, and it tells you that if you live in a certain way, your society will improve. You'll live longer, you'll live happier, you'll see your kids grow old, right? It's individual moral training. But outside of law, why would someone delve into the metaphysical?
Well, we have laws. I mean, we have, we have the Wiccan Rede, for example, which says, "Do as thou wilt, but harm none." So we have laws. It's just that we don't have 600 of them.
Right. I mean, it's kind of simple to say, don't do bad and don't do harm, but you need standards of what harm is, what wrong is, and what right is. And this is why we have so many laws.
If you're chopping off somebody's head, you're probably doing wrong. Just call it a hunch. I mean, oh well.
This is why, like, if someone tells me they believe in God, they don't really tell me much. Now, if they tell me that this God has a moral code for them to live by, then that tells me a lot about the person. This is why being spiritual is overrated. Right?
You don't harm yourself, you don't harm others, and you don't violate anyone's rights. And as long as you do those three things, you should be good to go. Right. You should be good to go.
So I think ethically that gets you by, but positive commandments instead of negative ones. A negative commandment tells you not to do something, while a positive commandment tells you to aspire to do something. That's actually what makes the world a better place.
No,
so
exactly.
Just not doing evil doesn't really help us progress ethically. It just keeps us ethically stagnant.
I agree, but isn't that?
I want to push this issue a little bit. Yeah, I just want to push. What's an example of a positive commandment? Thank you for coming by, Jackie, and have a good dinner. Bon appetit. So, what would be an example of a positive commandment that would make a world a better place? I mean, in Judaism, positive commandments are put a mezuzah on your door, wrap tefillin.
Wait, hold on.
Say Kaddish.
So we have to make a distinction. We have to make a distinction between ceremonial laws and ethical laws. For example, burn the evil from amongst your midst. Love your neighbor as yourself. Honor your parents. These are positive commandments that aren't ceremonial. Now, wrapping tefillin, keeping Shabbat, fasting on Yom Kippur, these are ceremonial laws. This is why, like, when most people try to represent Judaism as an ethical force, they typically use laws that aren't ethically relatable to people. What does lighting candles on Shabbat have to do with making the world a better place? Nothing really. Now, I believe that these laws, in Hebrew we call them hukim, ceremonial edicts, are there to strengthen the ethical ones. Right? Now, I believe this in faith. I believe that if someone puts on tefillin, it's going to create many little mental, ethical landmarks in their mind. Saying the bracha right before you eat is going to remind you about God and where you stand in the world constantly. Where the average Jew knows what he had for breakfast, knows what he had for lunch. Why? Because he could remember what bracha he made or didn't make, whether he's meat or dairy, like if he's fleshik or milchik. It helps him live a perceptive existence, while the average non-believer doesn't really acknowledge all the miracles that happen in our life daily, that what they eat, what they drink, certain occasions, a child being born. While in Judaism, we have constant reminders tied to many of these events in life, a lot of them rabbinic, to keep us grounded. So it helps you live a more conscious existence being religious, and in particular being Jewish. In terms of ethical laws that are positive, there are many of them but even Christians keep, whether they acknowledge them or not. I mean, I think Christians and even Muslims keep a lot of the ethical commands in Torah, whether they acknowledge them as commandments or not. Because in terms of Christians, they follow someone who was Jewish, who had a religious backbone. If you're a Muslim, you follow someone who basically plagiarized all these ethical concepts into an Arabized form. It all stems back to the Torah. And we see what happens when societies turn their back on the Torah and the Bible in general. They leave a trail of death and carnage. An example is the Soviet Union, Vietnam, North Korea, Cuba, Cambodia.
No argument for me. Atheism is a curse, in my opinion.